Hello and welcome to a masterclass in Mariology. This is Dr. Mark Miravalle. I'm joined by my longtime colleague and friend, Dr. Robert Fastiggi. And in this masterclass, we are going to discuss the new norms regarding private revelation in the discernment of mystical phenomena, reported alleged phenomena, the May 17th, 2024 norms, which were released by the Dicastery for the Doctrine of Faith. And I want to go through with Dr. Fastiggi both the nature of the norms, how these differ from 1978, and also to discuss a few of the decisions that have come out. There have to date already been 9 decisions. The decisions that have come out, and also, well, even 10, we would say, with including the decision on Medjugorje, and also some of the themes that have run through some of these decisions that perhaps could be even better clarified in the future. So, Robert, thanks as always for being with us. It's a joy and privilege to have you joining us.
Oh, it's my honor. All for our Blessed Mother, who's the mother of the church, really the mother of all humanity.
That's right, the mother of all people. Say amen. So let's talk about the norms. So most of our listeners may have heard different snippets about this, but let's just summarize that, in fact, from 1978, we have norms that are released, sometimes called the Cardinal Seper norms. Cardinal Seper was the prefect for the Dicastery, at that time, Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith. And there were norms for evaluating private revelation. And then it was decided by, but they were still somewhat secretive at that time. And then it was decided by Cardinal Ladaria later to release these, Cardinal Levada, to release these. And now they were under discussion. They were being used by bishops to evaluate reported private revelation. And then in May of 2024, we have really a very substantial change from the previous norms. Can you give us a little summary of some of the substantial differences between 78 norms and now the 2024 norms?
Yeah, I think there's 2 major differences. One was in the 1978 norms, the local bishop was the one with the authority. Now, the local bishop could, if he was undecided, turn to the conference of bishops of his area or country, or turn to the Holy See for help. But there were a number of cases that we know of where the local bishop asked the congregation for the doctrine of the faith for intervention or an opinion. They said, no, you make the decision. So, and that also is another major difference, that the local bishop or even the Holy See or the Conference of Bishops could make a judgment that it consists of the supernatural, or it shows evidence of the supernatural. Now, the highest approval could be nihil obstat. Nothing stands in the way of people being devoted, like with the recent statement about Medjugorje, or I suppose in believing the messages, but they were described as, text for spiritual edification, but no judgment made about the supernatural quality, only now allowing the Roman pontiff in rare cases to make judgments of the supernatural. Okay. And the reason given for this, as you know, is they say, well, private revelations are not obligatory. And if the bishop makes a judgment or a statement, the Blessed Mother really did appear, like at Our Lady of Lourdes, then the faithful will feel they must follow the bishop and believe, but it was not obligatory. But as you know, I wrote a recent article published in Ecce Mater Tua, going through this change and just giving historical examples of bishops making clear statements of the supernatural. And yet, if you read carefully, many of them also say, yes, it is the Blessed Mother really did appear, or there's grounds, the faithful, all the signs show that the faithful, have good reason to believe this as undoubtable and supernatural. I mean, that was the language of the bishop of Grenoble. He just said that the faithful have good grounds for believing this.
Right.
And a number of them, as you know, also said it's not obligatory. Maybe we could talk about that.
That's right. Let's anchor down on those two major changes. I'm glad that you bring it up so clearly, Robert. One is that the local bishop, and this is breaking a half millennium precedence, at least it goes back to Guadalupe, that the local bishop no longer has the authority of making the first discernment and decision. Now, under the 1978 norms, the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith always had the ability, if they sought, were under the impression that there was not a thorough investigation or any other dubiosity, that they could take authority. They always had authority over the local bishop, but now these new norms have said, no, the local bishop cannot make a declaration at all. So I think that is concerning. One has to question, is it really to the benefit of the people of God when the shepherd, the successor of the apostle in that region, does not have the ability to exercise a spiritual authority for the good of the faithful? It seems like that's kind of connatural to being the pastor, the shepherd protecting his people, to make a statement on this. And as you pointed out before, and in your excellent article, many of these statements, for example, Bishop Ito in Akita says very explicitly, you don't have to believe in this. It's a private revelation. No one is obliged, because those were the two big reasons why they came up with the new norms in the explanatory notes early in the introduction. One was because we're afraid that people think that you have to believe in a private revelation once a bishop says something positive. Well, I would respectfully differ in saying, I think the vast majority of people knew that you did not have to believe in a private revelation. But for those who were not sure, the easy way to solve that is just to say, okay, from now on, bishops, include in your statement that they don't have to believe that. So that's the one area. And then the second, as you articulate well, is these new categories. So before, we had the three classic categories. And, Robert, I know we talked about this, off air, about during the presentation of Cardinal Fernandez on September 19th of 2024, they were constantly making references to the old categories, which supposedly no longer exist. So again, for our viewers, what are those old categories? Constate supernaturalitate, this consists of a supernatural origin. Middle category, non constate de supernaturalitate, the supernatural character has not been affirmed or established, or in the German, fixed with their Teutonic precision. Or constate non supernaturalitate, that is to say, we're establishing that this is not supernatural. I was amazed how often Cardinal Fernandez, both in context and also in answering questions, went through this. In one question, even specified the difference between constate non and non constate. But those are technically gone categories, except for the constate non, which is the sixth category. So now we have this series of 6 new categories. But as you again pointed out well, the first category, the highest possible category, is simply saying there's nothing that stands in the way. That is to say, there's no doctrinal error. There's nothing that's clearly inhibiting the faithful. So that's another major change, is leaving these 3 classic categories and then going to 6 categories, which I did an EWTN, the Great Britain interview recently, and the host was saying, I find these new categories very confusing. They're not particularly user-friendly. So can you comment a little bit on these new categories in general, these 6 new categories?
Yes. Well, I mean, after nihil obstat is the highest form of approval, but even then you're not making a judgment that it's supernatural origin, but nothing stands in the way of believing that, or nothing stands in the way of the devotion and going to the site. But I think the next one was, it's held before our eyes.
Yeah.
It's under
right.
observation.
Yeah. Pre oculis habeatur. You know, it's
Yeah,
almost like keep your eyes on it.
yeah, it's under observation, and then coratur, it's kind of like take care or be be careful here, but not prohibited. And then there's two that are more under mandate, mandato. The bishops issues a kind of mandate that you're not supposed to promote this, and then there's one that's even stronger, prohibiatur. It's prohibited. It's very clear. And then the the most negative is it is not supernatural. Non constate supernaturalitate. Now, those were sometimes used before, like with Our Lady of Bayside. Bishop Mogavero said, no, it's not supernatural, and he encouraged. And some people still continued going there for years afterwards. But there's a case there of obedience. So, but these categories now in the 78 norms, they only mention two. Constat, non constat, and constat de non. No, yeah, that was it. They didn't know.
Constate supernaturalitate.
Constat de supernaturalitate and non constat. They didn't have the most negative, but it still was used. These were just guidelines.
So in these new ones, again, you've got the highest one is nihil obstat, nothing stands in the way. They still say, you should stay in touch and oversee, which is all fine. And by the way, I don't want to at all imply that there's not a need to clearly prohibit and condemn false apparitions. I think there absolutely is. I think that's a critical pastoral responsibility. But you do have, you're kind of bottom heavy in terms of the negative subcategories with this. So, pre oculis habeatur, keep your eyes on this. That's, there seems to be good indications, but there might be some need to keep in touch with the visionary. Well, quite frankly, that was always the case. I mean, the bishop always had the responsibility to keep in touch. Who knows what was coming later? And then curatur is a bit of a fascinating category because it's saying, look, we see serious problems, but it had spread, there's reliable fruits. And so we are not going to upset the people of God, but rather the bishop is going to dissuade people from it. Well, just from a theological perspective, I find that unusual, because how do you get reliable spiritual fruits from something that's false or something that's not authentic? Matthew 7, particularly verse 18 says, you can't get good fruit from a bad tree. Yeah. And so that's a bit of an odd category because it's saying, look, there's real problems, but there's reliable fruits. We don't want to upset the people, kind of dissuade people. I personally would say, look, if you got serious reasons to think it's not of God, then it's okay to upset the people, because that's a pastoral thing. It's like parents upsetting their children. You can do that when it's for their safety. And then, the category of submandato I find to be a bit, again, inconsistent. That is to say, if something happened at Fatima, someone went to Fatima and they brought it back to the United States, but there was something problematic with the way they were relaying it in the United States, that the bishop would have to say, okay, I'm responsible for that, and I want to I want to identify that as a problem. But you would, it seems to me more logical that you would categorize the United States phenomena as submandato, not Fatima as submandato, because that's still authentic. So, and then of course you have the two negative and negativer, to use bad English, because the categories are really, so, it's prohibitor. And then the last one is, we're declaring it to be a not of God, and in a sense of finding, red paint that was the reason for the blood on the statue or something like that. But I think overall, Robert, and I'd love to hear your opinion on this, but my sense is overall, it's certainly with removing the ability of the bishop to make a positive statement, and then kind of downloading 6 categories, the last 4 of which are really fairly serious in negativity and gradation, that the people I've talked to said, the overall sense is a little bit less of an appreciation, a little bit more of a downplaying, de-emphasizing of apparitions in general.
No,
Do you
I
think
know.
that's a fair assessment?
I think so. In other words, the false apparitions or the ones that are questionable seem to be ruling the mindset of the dicastery. Now, granted, there have been many that are questionable and so on, and so that bishops sometimes just don't know what to do. So some have said, well, these other categories give them options. They don't have to just say supernatural or not supernatural. But the non-constat, even as Cardinal Fernandez explained it seemed like it's almost in the equivalent of the curator. It's not established, but, take care, it's not established, but not prohibiting people from going there or not encouraging it. And that came up when the question was asked about Garabandal. And he seemed to and he was accurate. He said it's non constat de
Right.
supernaturalitate. The supernatural has not been established. But, if some of these things go on and further study, they can be reversed.
That's right. These are disciplines. And, it's almost like you want to proclaim that from the mountaintops to remind people, these are disciplines. Disciplines should be obeyed, but they are by their very nature, changeable. They're not dogma. They're not doctrine, neither of which can be intrinsically changed. Disciplines can certainly be intrinsically changed, excuse me. And so, I also found it was interesting that this series, so now we've had 10, I think, including Medjugorje's 10, since May 17th. And in that exchange of questions with Cardinal Fernandez, he was asked, for example, well, did you interview the visionaries at Medjugorje? And he said, no, we had enough material already. So, and I think that's been the rule rather than the exception, that they have not undertaken a new firsthand prima facie investigation, talking to the visionaries, listening to the testimony of eyewitnesses, that really has not been done. This really seems to be more of a kind of armchair examination of texts, of reports, and of course, those are legitimate sources. But I think when you're not giving new investigation, new firsthand research, one wonders, again, I'd use the example, I wouldn't pick a university based on just the paperwork, or I wouldn't take a job just on paperwork, or I wouldn't ask someone to marry me just on paperwork. And so if you have to answer the question, is the Mother of God appearing? You would want to get as proximate, as experiential, as well as deductive and theoretical, speculative as possible. And I'm not sure that what we've seen in the last 3 months or so has been a new hands-on investigation, but rather prudential judgments regarding the devotion, not really about the apparition.
No, exactly. I suppose some people would respond saying, well, the first-hand research is done at the local level. Then the bishop sends his report to the dicastery, and then the dicastery makes the judgment, sending, this seems to be okay. But again, the dicastery, for the most part, is relying upon the report. But if you're making a judgment from the Holy See, you would want to investigate further. Now with Medjugorje, there was a papal commission appointed 2010, and it concluded its work in 2014. So they did have that data, but now they're making a judgment without any further interviews, and the visionaries are still alive.
Yeah. So it's been a decade. It's been 10 years from, and I'm not clear how much interviews were part of the Ruini report. That also is not clear. Now there were earlier commissions, but that I understand that response of people say, well, yeah, the bishop's involved at the first stage. Yes, but he doesn't make the call. So if the dicastery, which is 6 or 8 or 10 theologians, we don't know exactly, but a group of theologians, uh, if they have the authority over the bishop, then yes, they're taking for consideration the bishop's research, but the people that are making the decision are not the same people who are doing the interviewing or doing the examination. When someone's before you, Robert, there's something, ontological and existential about being able to see, look them in the eyes. How do they respond to these? Is there humility? Are there attitudinal agendas? I think those are all legitimate parts of trying to make a determination of integrity and then ultimately of authenticity, which now can no longer be completely, declared.
Yeah, and we think in terms of the affirmation of miracles for beatification, how the Holy See is so scrupulous in investigating these. And so now the argument is, well, because of modern means of communication, something that happens in Venezuela or Argentina or Japan has worldwide, people can access information about it. So, but still, it's still local. It still occurred locally, and that would seem to be the best, the one to discern it. I mean, do bishops not have, if bishops have the ability to discern who's a suitable candidate for the priesthood, say, relying upon the reports of the formators at a seminary, and I teach at a seminary, so I know about this. Do they not have also the charism to discern the supernatural?
Yeah, it's a great example, Robert. And also, there's a bit of an inconsistency because, as we've said before, if you go up Piazza San Pietro, the St. Peter's Basilica, and you veer to the left, you go to the Sant'Uffizi, where the Holy Office was. That's what Sant'Uffizi means, but now the DDF. And they're now saying no ecclesial declaration of the supernatural. But if you veer to the right, a destra, as you're going up the square, then you're going to the canonization of saints dicastery, and they require 2 such supernatural declarations of miracles to be beatified, another to be canonized. And so it kind of begs the question, well, which is it? I mean, it seems oddly inconsistent to have one office say we require a supernatural declaration, and then the other office says, no, we can't do it, only the Pope in rare circumstances. And as we've talked about before, what about the miracles at Lourdes, Robert? How does that work? If are they going to be able to declare supernatural miracles at Lourdes or only neo-obstats?
That's right. I mean, look, we have to make the private judgment whether we're in the state of grace before receiving Holy Communion. And grace is supernatural, so even individuals have an ability to somehow discern the working of the supernatural, right?
And yes, and the Catechism, has that nice reference of how, along with the Magisterium, the Sensus fidelium do discern things that are supernatural, the dimension of prophecy, and so this is a teaching of the Catechism that we're called to do that universally, along with the guidance of the Magisterium as well. So discernment of spirits is part of what we're supposed to do, and we're supposed to not stifle the spirit as well, as St. Paul tells us.
So this is what the Catechism number 67 says: guided by the Magisterium of the Church, the sensus fidelium, the sense of the faithful, knows how to discern and welcome in these revelations whatever constitutes an authentic call of Christ or his saints to the church. So if the sensus, or this supernatural instinct or discernment of the faithful, can discern what is an authentic call from Christ or the saints, certainly the bishop is a member of the faithful. So at the end of my article, I stated, well, I guess the bishop could say, speaking personally, as a member, I believe that Our Lady appeared, but no one is required to believe this. But I give my nihil obstat, for those who wish to believe that.
That's right.
Nothing stands in the way. But you mentioned these various rulings, 9 related to reported apparitions. Some of them I was very happy about, like Vilankini. I know priests from India who have gone there many times, and they say it's just a wonderful spiritual place. But the apparitions occurred in the 1500s. I mean, we're talking about a long time ago. So, but the decision, the judgment seems to be, well, there's nothing harmful about going there. There's good spiritual fruits, so we have nothing opposed to this devotion. Is that what you find? Like they're mostly saying, yeah, you're not putting yourself in jeopardy, your soul in danger by being devoted to Rosa Mystica or Medjugorje or Malankini.
Yeah, I think in general, that's the case. And in fact, the letter to Vilankili wasn't even really a declaration. It was kind of the Pope wanting Cardinal Fernandez to say, again, an affirming dimension of Vilankili, because it's so established. It's the Lourdes of India. So I find, Robert, that and I'm glad you bring this up, because I want to get into a couple of these cases specifically, but I find that, except for things like Amsterdam and Rosa Mystica a little bit more, and now Medjugorje, the other have been kind of safe bets, so to speak. These are local, regional events like Our Lady of the Rock in southern Italy, Chandavila in Spain, Prévosion in France. These are really local, regional at best. Not many people from neighboring countries, I would dare say, are even aware of these. Most people I talk to, when they announced, the nihil for Our Lady of the Rock or the Mercy Trinity locutions up in northern Italy, had never heard of these. So I think a lot of these were fairly safe bets. I think things got a little bit more spicy, of course. Rosa Mystica is a little bit more extended, but for example, let's talk about Rosa Mystica for a moment, Robert. So in the document, I've been to Rosa Mystica, very beautiful. I gave a retreat to 100 priests there in Rosa Mystica, apparitions in the 1940s. But in the document, this has become kind of a pattern. In the document, while they talk about, some of the spiritual fruits, they also point out that Our Lady refers to herself as Mary the Redemption and Mary Mediatrix, and several times reference of that Mary mediates between her Son and humanity. And then they made kind of a concerning commentary on that. Could you bring us up to date on kind of what they said regarding Our Lady's mediation in that Rosa Mystica commentary?
There's a statement there that says, in the action of grace, but this would be sanctifying grace, which only comes from Christ through the working of the Holy Spirit, no mediation is possible, not even that of Our Lady. Our Lady's mediation must always be understood in light of as her intercession, which opens souls up to the working of grace. But I'm preparing a letter to send to Cardinal Fernandez, and I have some people supporting me on this, just raising the question, how does this statement that in the working of divine grace in the soul, there's no mediation possible, how do we understand so many papal affirmations of Mary as mediatrix of all graces, including Pope Francis has affirmed that title, and Pope Benedict XVI. And even stronger, there's no fruit of grace in the history of salvation that does not by necessity involve the mediation of Mary. So certainly Mary's not the source of grace. St. Pius X made this clear in his 1904 encyclical Ad Diem Illum. She's not the source, but she communicates the grace. I mean, is it, in the action of grace in the soul, is there no possible mediation of Mary or cooperation of Mary? How then could St. Paul VI in Signum Magnum and also in the Credo of the People of God say that Mary cooperates in the birth and development of grace in the souls. This is quoted by John Paul II in Redemptoris Mater. So if she's cooperating in the birth and development of grace, but in this, the DDF gives the idea, in this action of grace, no mediation is possible.
Yeah, it's really extraordinary. And as you know, I've written a piece precisely on this, and we have that in Ecce Matatua as well. And Robert, that statement on its own contradicts 13 popes, 5 encyclical teachings. And you mentioned our present Holy Father, Pope Benedict XVI, who sounds like de Montfort, saying, the necessary, intercession, role, mediation of Our Lady. Also, St. John Paul II on 9 times calls her the mediatrix of all graces. And so you've got 4 centuries of papal teaching against this statement. And, it seems to have been, somewhat repeated with a little different emphases. It was repeated in the Medjugorje message again, this idea that, we don't use mediation. It wasn't as blatant, I would say, as it is in the Rosa Mystica. But, that also seems to be a pattern that's going on, Robert, where they will select the references. Now, these are all Nihil obstats for now. So they're saying there's no doctrinal error. Nothing stands in the way. They'll select messages where Our Lady identifies herself as the mediatrix of all graces. I am the mediatrix between God and humanity. Of course, her son is Jesus, so she can say that. I'm almost in a La Salette type of fashion. I'm holding back the justice of my son as mediatrix. So they identify it, and then they qualify it as concerning. This was one of the things they mentioned in one of the concerns and clarifications in the Medjugorje apparition statement too, that there's she calls herself mediatrix. It says, I am the mediatrix in relationship between the Father and humanity too. And they say, well, these are concerning. So it just seems like it wasn't just a quote slip. I mean, we hope it was, but there's this ongoing tendency to minimize Our Lady's role in mediation as only that of an advocate or of intercession.
Exactly. When I mentioned this to Dr. Laurie Olson, who now has published this book, Mary and the Church at Vatican II, and she studied the archives and the discussions at Vatican II, she said, this is the Squadra Belgia, the Belgian squad. They wanted to mitigate or really remove any reference to Mary as mediatrix. This was Monsignor Gerard Phillips. This was what he tried to do. And there were others who didn't want to see mediatrix in Lumen Gentium, chapter 8, but it's there. They worked out a compromise that it would be surrounded by other titles, and none of these titles, can be understood, so they take away or add anything to the dignity of Christ, the one mediator. But the way Mary's mediation of all grace, it never took away from Christ as the one mediator. It was her mediation is a participation in his mediation with and under the mediator, with and under the Redeemer. But as St. Louis de Montfort says, you are, O Lord, always with Mary, and Mary is always with you. I mean, Vatican II speaks about this indissoluble bond between Jesus and Mary.
Unfortunately, on August 5th of 2024, Pope Francis really corrected this statement of the DDF, although, again, I have to say, it seems to be continuing. It's in the document of September 19th of 2024 in Medjugorje, but Pope Francis says that she mediates, the grace which comes always and only from Jesus Christ by the power of the Holy Spirit. Well, that's wonderful. That's exactly true. But that's what's being denied, unfortunately, by the Chief Doctrinal Office in these commentaries. And so that's never an ideal situation where you have, doctrinal statements coming out that are contradicting not only the past 4 centuries, but also the present Holy Father. Well, let me also mention, so Rosa Mystica comes out. and gets the nihil obstat. There was a statement on Amsterdam, and I don't want to go into too much detail on this, but there was a statement which basically said that it's to be considered as presently as a constat de non supernaturalitate, and without getting into all the back history of the statements on the Vatican's own website that said it's not a constat de non, it's a non constat, but and the congregations contacting the Bishop of Amsterdam over the years in the 1980s, saying you could allow devotion, just hold off on a statement of authenticity. So there's a lot of dubiosity with that, but they just kind of came out with a statement saying, no, we hold it's constat de non, but there was not any rationale. There clearly was no reference of new research. And again, that's why it seems like these statements are not necessarily going back to the sources, but rather making prudential calls based on preference. I thought it was absolutely revealing during the interview that Cardinal Fernandez stated. He said, well, at Medjugorje, there's no doctrinal problems, like the call for the dogma of co-redemptrix at the Lady of All Nations of Amsterdam. No, nothing like that in Medjugorje. Well, I thought that was quite an omission, because it wasn't a problem with the visionary or the phenomena, but it seemed to be a problem with a definition, which really dates back to 1915 with Cardinal Mercier, who had spiritual maternity be always in his documents emphasized the foundation for that is Our Lady's role as the co-redemptrix.
Yes, I remember the Cardinal saying, this at Our Lady of All Nations, there was the insistence on the dogma. But you've been involved with this for so long. Have you been insisting that the dogma be proclaimed? You've been asking. That's different.
And in fact, I mean, the church, this canon, 212, it says the faithful have that responsibility. So to petition the Holy Fathers, I mean, were they not petitioning for the dogma of the Assumption with 8 million petitions from 1854 until 1950? So those are always legitimate things. But again, I thought it was revelatory that he didn't talk about any doctrinal errors, but the desire for a dogma, the call for a dogma, which would rather reduce what he says to not a doctrinal issue, but a doctrinal preference. I mean, perhaps they don't prefer, and that's fine, but you can't call it a doctrinal error to have a petition for the fifth Marian dogma, unless, Robert, you want to say, well, there's 700 cardinals and bishops and 8 million people in the last 30 years that are all in doctrinal error, including you and me, who have petitioned as faithful sons and daughters of the church for this dogma. So I think it was an unfortunate revelation that came through his question and answer session.
Well, in a way, I was happy he said that, because it confirmed our suspicions.
Yeah.
This is the reason, and of course, the reason why Bishop Hendricks in December of 2020 overturned the approval, the constate supernaturalitate of Bishop Punt, was he was told that St. Paul VI had approved the 1974 statement. Well, of course, the Pope could approve it then. It doesn't mean that it didn't seem to prevent Bishop Punt from making a positive judgment in May of 2002. If that was going against the Pope, why was he told not immediately to withdraw his approval?
Yeah, and in fact, why would there be over 25 years under Cardinal Ratzinger no reference of this Paul VI confirmation? But I think what we want to emphasize as well is that even with a Paul VI confirmation, it's still a discipline. So Pius XI confirmed the prohibition of Saint Padre Pio, who, and we're not supposed to do this on the air, whose feast we happen to be doing this program on. That was confirmed. John the 23rd confirmed the prohibition of divine mercy. These things can be overturned. So, but let's go to Medjugorje if we can now with the new statement. And of course, I was interviewed on the Miracle Hunter recently and said, well, okay, so what's the difference between September 18th and September 19th? And I said, well, there's not a substantial difference because on September, 19th is the day of the Medjugorje statement, right? Well, on the 18th, there was official pilgrimages. The Holy Father was sending, taped messages to or live streaming to the crowds of 50, 70,000 youth conferences that they had there. And people could go. No one was obliged to believe in Medjugorje, but you certainly could. So what has substantially changed in the September 19th statement? Well, there's been a bit of a formalizing, and I think this is a positive thing that, in fact, the Vatican gave Medjugorje the highest possible category. I think that's a positive thing. But I did find troubling from a theological perspective, Robert, this insistence on, speaking of insistences, the insistence on separating the spiritual fruits from the, quote, spiritual experience. Now, Cardinal Fernandez was very strong on that. He repeated it. He said, the fruits are not because of the apparitions, but they are in the midst of. Well, that certainly is vague to talk about in the midst of. I mean, does that imply that Our Lady or the Holy Spirit would come and give massively documented miracles, 47 million communions, 1,060,000 priests visiting, that Our Lady and the Spirit would give this to a group of kids that were just making up messages, or even if they had good intentions? So that disconnect between tree and fruits, I find is troublesome, and I don't think it's very consistent with what Jesus says in Scripture.
Oh, exactly. Well, they were quoting an offhand statement, I think, of Cardinal Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict XVI. These are happening in the midst of this, not because of it, but that was not the final judgment. And then, yes, it's separating the tree from its fruits, or the fruits from the tree. Now, one explanation is they say, well, people go looking for something. God is going to honor their good intentions with grace. So grace is always supernatural. But if there's nothing, strong, if there's many spiritual fruits there, even acknowledgement of miracles, certainly conversions, vocations, what is stimulating this? So David Murgia, who published the report on Medjugorje, he was quoted in the New York Times manifesting the same type of astonishment of this separation. But I think nihil obstat would mean no one is prohibited from believing that behind the messages is Our Lady herself.
Yeah.
And they say, go there not to meet the DDF says, go to Medjugorje not to meet the visionaries, but to encounter Our Lady. Yeah. Well, that's implying in a way that Our Lady was the one communicating to the visionaries.
Yeah, that it's true. And again, I think Chesterton would have to quip, well, why not go? If you remember in the interview, Robert, Cardinal Fernandez was asked whether he went to Medjugorje, and he said, no, well, yes, I did, but I had this whole trip set out of northern Italy. I was going to go here and here, and I was rather disappointed, and one of the priests in our group really wanted to go there and went on. Well, if he went to one of his, other places with the intention of being open to God, would God have blessed him as much there than at Medjugorje? I mean, one could go, to a beautiful beach in the Bahamas, being open to God. But the reason the church uses these norms, especially the biblical norms of spiritual fruits, is because you don't get what you get at Lourdes, Fatima, Guadalupe, and Medjugorje in going to just any other place. And that's one way the Spirit manifests that it is, in fact, his bride that's there. So again, that disconnect between fruits and trees, and simply to say, well, God is generous. Well, thanks be to God that he doesn't, people go to false apparition sites, and he doesn't, with the same openness, perhaps. Thanks be to God, he doesn't bless them the same way, because that would cause massive confusion if you had, tens of thousands of vocations of priest and religious life coming from a place of false apparition. So it's, again, I find it a very Rahnerian separation from, and I don't want to stretch this too far, but it's kind of like saying the resurrection of Jesus, this is an analogy, of course, the resurrection of Jesus, is it so important that he physically rose, or the spiritual experience that the faithful got from this that encouraged them? No, it's very important that he physically rose. And analogously, quite frankly, I think it hurts Our Lady. I think it's disrespectful, without intent for many, to say, we're so grateful for all your documented fruits, but we don't necessarily say it's from you. I think that disconnect is troubling.
There's something about the sacredness of a place where Our Lady has appeared. I remember the first time I went to Fatima, and I went there alone because I was at a conference in Lisbon. I had to get back, so I only had 2 hours there. I went by bus, and I go to the old basilica, and I was praying along the way, and then I looked at the basilica. I just started crying, and I couldn't control I said, she's here. I sense her.
Yeah.
She appeared here. And I just felt so privileged. So there's a kind of sacrality or sacredness of a place where people have had such transforming experiences. And I remember even once as a young man being in Paris and going in just haphazardly into a church. And there was a little sign on the confessional and says, here is where Charles de Foucauld, who's now a canonized saint, confessed his sins on such and such a date. That was the beginning of his. And I said, what this is a sacred place. This is where the conversion of a saint occurred.
It's a great point, Robert. I have felt that several times at Medjugorje, that the presence, the existential presence of Our Lady. And quite frankly, she doesn't give that everywhere. That's why people go to Lourdes and Guadalupe, Guadalupe is the most, pilgrimaged spot in the world. It's because people get grace when they go there, and they pass on that they had conversions and grace. So again, I don't think it's a case of kind of a reconstruction that somehow, just because they're open-hearted, they get there, but we don't know if it's Our Lady. I ultimately, I don't find that at the service of the people of God. I think it's much better to say, the bishop says it after a good examination. I think the evidence, like what was said at La Salette, I think the evidence supports a supernatural certainty. But you're not obliged to go if you don't want. You're not obliged to believe you don't want. But go ahead and give them. And again, for me, I would rather not exchange a theologian or a bishop in terms of discernment, even a Vatican theologian. We're both theologians, Robert. I'm happy to be a theologian. But I think there's a charism, a sapiential charism that is given to a bishop that theologians don't have. And I would rather have them make that initial statement and then follow it through as something that the faithful are open to.
Yeah, I mean, like January 18th, 1862, Bishop Bertrand Lawrence of Tarbes, France, published a statement, and I love what he said. The Immaculate Mother of God has really appeared to Bernadette.
Right.
Now a bishop can't say that now, or like, so he'd have to say personally, I believe. And so there's bishops are members of the faithful, but they do have a special charism. Now, I guess we have to work with the nihil obstat, and then it's nothing prevents the faithful from going to Medjugorje, going to Rosa Mystica, and believing in it.
Yeah.
No one's going to stop you from that. So we have to be grateful for that. But then we would like to see the shepherds of the church make that confirmation. I mean, we have it with the saints. Padre Pio really is a saint, and we're obliged to recognize him as a saint.
Right, because he really did have supernatural events called miracles attributed to him, and that's why we know he's a saint. That's heaven confirming it. So it's interesting that heaven does things like make bodies incorruptible. So it's not irrelevant to them. They're not just concerned about spiritual experience. They're concerned about objective acts which lead people to salvation and sanctification. And before closing too, in that Medjugorje statement, there were categories, there were like 6 clarifications. Now they did a nice job, I thought, about presenting some of the beautiful messages of Our Lady, although they kept saying, we're not saying this is Our Lady, but they exposed the faithful to them. I think they were very, very beautiful. But then they kind of concluded with areas of clarification. One of the areas of clarification was when she says things like my plan here or my project. And they say, well, she doesn't have a plan separate from Jesus. I think we kind of all know that. I found that a bit superficial as an objection. Another objection, that she kind of micromanages the parish, that she says, this parish is a special place that I'm going to guide. And then she asks for special prayer and preparation for the feast of her birth. And they found that to be, far too specific. But Robert, based on precedence, that's exactly what she does at Fatima. At Fatima, in the August 19th, 1917 apparition, they say, what should we do with the money? And Our Lady says to Lucia, you put it into 2 litters. You take this with Jacinta and 2 other girls dressed in white, and then Francisco with 3 other boys will take it, and half will be used for the feast of Our Lady of the Rosary. The other half for the construction of the church. But it's very specific, and it's not micromanaging. The Mother of God, Queen of the Universe, Mother of the Church, Mother of all peoples, can give kids instructions on how to prepare for a feast. That's really in Catholic precedents regarding approved private revelation.
Exactly, or like at Our Lady of the Miraculous Medal, that the confessor of St. Catherine was resisting, and St. Catherine was told by the lady, that this is Father Aladel, he is my servant, and he should be frightened of displeasing me.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's great, because that was another category, reprimands. They found a fault with the idea that Our Lady would say, if you don't start living this message, I'm going to stop giving you messages. But that's throughout the Marian message to the modern world. So one wonders, are they familiar with the precedences? And in any case, their objection to these are logically objections to again, the perfect example of, Our Lady's Mother of Priests too. She can admonish a priest like she admonished anyway. So, but in general, we thank God for Our Lady's appearances. As you said, well, people still can personally believe, as they've been believing for years. And, the new categories, in a certain sense, and always respecting in the sense that they are norms now, at least presently, they could change, just like 78 changed to this. They won't prevent Our Lady from coming where she wants, as often as she wants, and hopefully with the same kind of global fruits as was documented by the Vatican in the statement on Medjugorje. So, well, Robert, thank you. Outstanding commentary, and I think it always, helps our viewers to digest and to analyze and to appreciate that which is good, and to also see which could be clarified in future statements. So, any final thoughts, Robert, on the norms and apparitions?
I like what you say, that Our Lady doesn't need permission. And, she's there as our mother. It is true, as at Medjugorje, one message was, I'm closer to you in the Eucharist, than even here. So we have to, like St. Louis de Montfort said, when we receive the Eucharist, introduce Mary into our hearts so we could receive Christ more fruitfully. So, but these apparitions awaken the reality of Mary. I was talking to a Mariologist from Ireland. She said people had forgotten the Mariology wasn't being taught, but she said Medjugorje stimulated interest, and then they thought in the seminary we better try to say something to guide people on Mariology. But some are not well trained, and then even some of the theologians people find reliable. Now it's been exposed that something Father Rahner wrote in 1952, the Jesuit censors prevented from being published because of his view on the Assumption. And he said it would make no difference if we suddenly found the remains of Mary.
Well, that's staggering. And of course, as we know historically, it was Rahner who met at the Fulda conference between the first and second sessions that said terms like mediatrix should not be used because they can't be explained. We don't know how she mediates the graces of the sacraments. Well, Bernardine of Siena kind of knew back in the 15th century when he says all grace comes from God to Christ, Christ to Mary, Mary to the church. And I think, Robert, what they're forgetting is, if you attack Our Lady's mediation, what about the mediation of the church? What about the mediation of priesthood? Does a priest not have a role in the mediation of graces from God to the human heart? He surely does. And it's under Jesus and it's under Our Lady, because Our Lady is the mediatrix of all graces, because she's co-redemptrix, and she participates in the obtaining of the grace, all the graces, regardless of where it's distributed. So, well, very good. Well, thank you, Robert. And thank you all for joining us for this masterclass in Mariology. More to come. We will continue to look at Our Lady's powerful appearances throughout the world in what is now designated as the Age of Mary. Thank you all. God bless you.